Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me on one of my regular updates from Washington, D.C. I'm going to hit three topics very quickly at the top and then be happy to take your questions. First, and as all things in Washington, nothing comes easy or simply, but today or tomorrow, the House is going to vote on my joint consolidation student loan bill. This is an issue that I've been working on now, I think, 5 years. And it came about because a constituent, Sarah from McLean, came to our office and said that she had consolidated her student loans with her husband. The husband ended up being an abuser. She got out of the marriage, left Texas, moved to McLean, and because of this program that had existed between 1993 and 2006, anybody that consolidated their loans during that period couldn't unconsolidate their loans if they had a spousal abuse, if they got divorced. They were, in effect, bonded together forever. Matter of fact, the federal government realized there was a program and stopped that ability to have these joint consolidated loans never unwound in 2006. So there were still over 10,000 Americans that fell into this category. Sarah was one of them. Earlier this summer, we passed the bill unanimously in the Senate, and either today or tomorrow it will be up, and I, with the help of my friend Bobby Scott, know it will pass in the House and it'll get to the president's desk. And literally for a whole cohort of Americans that are still in oftentimes an abusive relationship they've tried to get out of, they're still bearing the burden of a consolidated loan where their delinquent spouse doesn't pay at all, and the payer ends up having to pay for the combined student debt of both parties. In Sarah's case, she'll still have to pay down her portion of the student debt, but her abusing former husband will have to be stuck with his share of those debts. This is long overdue. It shouldn't have taken this long, but it is a small piece of relief for a targeted number of Virginians and Americans, and I'm happy it's finally happening and get to the president's desk later this week. Secondly, we've put out, Tim Kaine and I put out a lot of material on this. We're very proud of the fact that through what used to be called earmarks, now congressionally designated spending, Senator Kaine and I have achieved $135 million in specific projects around the Commonwealth of Virginia, across a whole host of areas. I've got my cheat sheet here if anybody wants to ask me on a specific project. That still has to end up in the final appropriations bill that will probably come to before the Congress at the end of the year. So we've still got a last hurdle to do, but the fact that it was built into the Appropriation Committee's so-called marks mean that I think these Virginia communities and these Virginia projects can look forward to this critically important federal funding. And then finally, this is a movie that I think we've all seen before, and the expectation today is that we're not going to go through any kind of ridiculous, stupid government shutdown. We hit October 1. We've got to make sure we continue to fund the government. Virginia being the most dependent state upon federal spending, military spending. We pay an undue burden when there is government shutdowns. The last one, obviously, under President Trump, 35 days, caused enormous havoc. My hope is that we will get this CR done as quickly as possible, because literally when you get to those countdown days, the last 2 or 3 days before the end of the year, if you haven't passed the CR, if you've got this still overhang out there, you've got groups like, for example, the air traffic controllers that already have to go through the shutdown preparations because they can't wait till 11:59 at the end of September to go through shutdown. So we're seeing already, as you get into those last week, we're seeing, whether it's air traffic controllers, we're seeing a lot of folks who are in the government contracting business already have to start preparing for a shutdown, even though it's not expected to happen. I think this threat of shutdowns I've had legislation for years that would, frankly, if you had a shutdown, would shut down the payment to the House and the Senate and the White House and their staffs, who frankly don't get exposed to the shutdown requirements. I'm not sure that's ever going to pass because, but in my mind, it's probably the most uniformly popular in the real world, least popular on Capitol Hill piece of legislation. But there needs to be some level of penalty on these threats of ridiculous shutdowns. God willing, we're not going to see that happen, but stay tuned. I think we've got 10, 11 days left before it will come to pass. With that, recognizing we may be a little short on the back end on time, I think I'm going to turn it over to Laura and be happy to start taking your questions.
Our first question will be from Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks a lot for joining us this morning. A question related to Russia and Ukraine, with Ukraine's president planning to speak to the General Assembly tomorrow. Russia today, as you're probably aware, is indicating it's going to hold referendums very soon to annex parts of eastern Ukraine. What are your thoughts on the latest developments there, and do you think the Senate will vote to include that close to $14 billion in military and economic aid for Ukraine soon?
I am confident that the Senate will continue to support the president's request for additional funding for Ukraine. It's roughly $14 billion. The Republican leadership has indicated they'd be supportive, with Ukraine making enormous gains in Kharkiv region in the northeast and continuing to keep pressure on in Kherson in the south. We need to continue to arm our Ukrainian allies. My hope as well is that our European allies will continue to send that equipment. Ukraine is on the offense. As much territory as they can reclaim before the winter sets in is extraordinarily important. And I know President Zelensky is going to speak to the UN General Assembly tomorrow, and I think that's important. I think it's curious that Russian President Putin is, what kind of reception he'd get. He's not even attending the UN General Assembly. He's sending his foreign minister, because I think increasingly Russia is a pariah state, because anyone who believes that existing borders ought to be maintained, clearly Russia has violated that basic UN principle. In terms of the efforts of the Russians to hold a frankly fake referendum in parts of the area that are controlled, Russia's been threatening that since August. I think if they bring about one of these referenda very quickly, literally in the next few days, it should be greeted by the rest of the world as what it is, a sham election forced upon, in many cases, unwilling participants. And I think there would be no outside observers, no credibility, and I think if they are forcing that kind of referendum, it should be viewed as a sham.
Senator, our next question will be Kelsey Childress with WSET. Kelsey? Okay, since we're short on time, we're going to move on to Randy Hagee with WMRA Radio in Harrisonburg.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for your time today. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the goals of the pipeline legislation that you and Senator Kaine have proposed, and whether it could have any bearing on the future of the Mountain Valley Pipeline.
Well, one of the things we saw with the Mountain Valley Pipeline process was that the ability to have public comment was, I think, FERC kind of mishandled some of that. So what Tim Kaine and I have done is we've laid out a piece of legislation, I'm not sure it'll get enacted, that would say we need to be clear about public input, number one. Number two, in terms of Mountain Valley, I know there's been a lot of discussion about permitting reform and some of the deal that may have been struck between Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer that included Mountain Valley. I've not seen any of the details on that, so I'm not going to weigh in on that at this point. I do think these processes ought to be allowed to continue. But on the larger question of permitting reform, I support it. I think, and we're talking not only here about pipelines, but I think about how I'm such an advocate for example, offshore wind. And I've seen the level of delay that we should, I think most all of us are supportive of more offshore wind, green energy, for Virginia, Virginia jobs. But this permitting process is literally adding years, and that simply drives up costs. So the core of permitting reform I would be supportive of, and again, we've seen no language, would be to say you don't need to lower the standards. All you need to do is put some level of time restriction in place. Or, and one of the things I'm very supportive of is rather than having these permits done sequentially, you get one permitting process done, then you start the next, then you start the next, is to do them simultaneously. So you start all of these permitting processes at the same time. Many other countries that have actually stricter environmental rules than we do have that process. They don't have this 2, 3, 5-year process in place because one of the things that has come out of the bill that the president signed in August, where we make the investments in green energy, you're going to have to build a lot of things, whether it's solar panels and solar farms, whether it's wind turbines, whether it's trying to move forward on nuclear power, you're going to have to build things. And our permitting process right now in this country is broken.
Senator, our next question will be Michael Martz with the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Yes, good morning, Senator. I'm interested in when you think the Congress will act on a continuing resolution for funding the government. I gather then you would wait till the end of the year for a budget vote. And in terms of the overall budget vote, you talked about what they used to be called earmarks. There's also some concern. I see the Committee for Responsible Federal Budgets raised some concerns today about, extenders being included in that legislation and other things that will increase the deficit and worsen inflation. How do you approach those issues, and when do you think they'll act on the CR?
Well, Michael, I think, real time, and this is mostly being driven by the Appropriations Committee, those discussions are going on, and whether the bill starts in the House or the bill starts in the Senate, I think we'll have some clarity on that issue by this Thursday. And because of the Jewish holidays, we're not going to have votes on Monday and through part of Tuesday. We'll start votes on Tuesday afternoon. So we're really into a short window next week. The government turns into a pumpkin on, I believe, next Saturday or Friday. So the time is short, and the sooner we can start this process, the sooner we can give the assurance to our federal employees, to our air traffic controllers, to government contractors that they're not going to be exposed to the insanity of a government shutdown, the better. And frankly, as for an economy that is still being challenged around supply chain issues, if the government were to shut down, that again just exacerbates some of our supply chain issues that again lead to further inflation. In terms of the questions around the congressionally designated spending, the $135 million that Tim Kaine and I have secured for Virginia projects, I've got a high level of confidence that'll be included in the final bill. In terms of the so-called extenders, Michael, I agree. I'm on the Finance Committee. This is a tool that both parties have used consistently where they extend only for a single year, in some cases retroactively, generally a series of small tax breaks that individually are small, but in aggregate do add to the debt and deficit. So I absolutely believe, and one of the things I wish we would have done in this last piece of legislation on the so-called Inflation Reduction Act would have been to kind of sort through those extenders, decide which ones need to be included permanently versus those that ought to be allowed to expire. As I think you remember, Michael, and many of the other media folks on the line may not recall, I literally spent years with my original gang, the Gang of Six, trying to implement the Simpson-Bowles plan, which would have brought down our national debt by about $4 trillion over a period of 5 to 7 years. Since that time, and we were obviously unsuccessful, the national debt has almost doubled, and that's been, both parties bear lots of blame. For so many years when inflation was so low, the going up to the national debt didn't really cost us that much. Now that you've seen interest rates go up, I'll just again, make this point that I've made for years on end and got basically ignored by both parties. Every time interest rates go up a total of 1%, just the debt that we pay on that national debt amounts to about $200 billion a year of additional spending off the top before we pay our military, before we pay Social Security, before we pay Medicare. That debt service has precedence over all of the other government programs. So this national debt with higher interest rates, it is going to finally come back and bite us. But this is going to take a gang of enormous credentials and potential to try to get us to realize that the imbalance between spend and revenues has to be reckoned with. Literally for the last 8 or 9 years, it has been ignored, but I unfortunately believe those days are coming to an end.
Danielle Sandler with WVNS.
Hi, good morning, Senator. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure my connection's okay. I just wanted to know more about the consolidation loan, the Joint Consolidation Loan Separation Act. I just wanted to know the advantages and the disadvantages of this act, and how does it benefit each person in the long run, if you can expand on that.
Well, here's what happened, is this was a program that only existed from 1993 to 2006. And during that period, if a married couple decided to consolidate their debt so they only had to make one payment, that was the process. Now, the upside was you only had to make one loan payment, and if you were a married couple, the assumption was you'd make that jointly. And if one spouse versus another was making more, they could work on this as a couple. Matter of fact, in 2006, they stopped this program because the flaws that had been exposed, which showed that, well, what happens if a couple actually divorced? If you divorced, or if one of the spouses was an abuser, you had no way to get out of that obligation. So if your rotten husband or wife, started being a deadbeat and didn't pay their share, because you jointly signed on to that consolidation note, you were still obligated for 100% of the joint cost of that student debt. The government realized in 2006 that was kind of crazy. So the problem, though, was, I wasn't even fully aware of this till about 2014 or 15, when a constituent came up from Sarah from McLean and said, hey, I got out of this awful relationship in Texas, but my deadbeat former spouse, I'm still having to pay his student debt because the government won't allow me to get out of this consolidation that I signed, I think it was back in the 90s in the case of Sarah. So what this common sense piece of legislation says is that if you are divorced, you don't have to continue to pay for both spouses. You just have to pay for your share. I think it is common sense. It passed the Senate unanimously, which shows that it's pretty common sense. It will pass in the House, I think, on an overwhelming bipartisan measure. And while the number of individuals that are affected is, I think, about 12,000, it's small, but the relief it will give to folks like Sarah is really significant. I know my colleague in the House, David Price, who's from North Carolina, who's been leading, he's got a whole group of, I think he's got a whole group of folks from not just from North Carolina, but from around the country who are going to be affected by this. And literally their lives dramatically improved because of this ability to sever this obligation that in many cases is over 20 years old. And in many cases, many of these people have been out of an abusing relationship, out of a failed marriage for more than a decade. So this is one of those, I think, common sense, shouldn't have taken this long, but we can celebrate hopefully today or tomorrow when it passes the House and the President's indicated he'll sign it.
Senator, our next question is from Jackie DeFusco with WIRC. Jackie? Okay, we're going to move on to Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. Last Friday, the Virginia Department of Education released a document with new model policies, which appear to be rolling back some of the transgender protections or accommodations implemented for students last year. These changes are set to impact an estimated 6,200 teenage transgender students in Virginia alone. And I imagine that they're probably pretty concerned about what all this means for them right now. I was just wondering, is there anything that you'd like to say to those students?
Well, Amy, I thought it was curious that this was announced late on a Friday afternoon, simply to, my understanding at least, a certain right-wing media. And I guess one of the things I've heard from, the governor's office was that he wants to return more control to parents. And in many ways, I agree with that. But what seems to be a little bit contradictory, and I've read some, I've got to do some more review, but that my understanding is this new policy would literally say, if a parent, for example, had accepted their trans students' pronoun choices, that the parents' acceptance of how they thought their kid ought to be addressed, they don't have the right to make that decision. It has to somehow go and get a court order. I think that seems to me to be the obvious of respecting parents' wishes. So I got to dig into this a little bit more, but it does seem a little bit contradictory in terms of respecting parents and how they ought to appropriately raise their children.
Senator, that was our final question.
Laura, I just want to make sure, did either of those folks who didn't pop through, do they, because I know we've got a couple more moments now, did any one of them want to kind of re-ask since we passed over them, or maybe they went off the air?
Jump back on, see if Jackie DeFisco with WRIC, are you on the line? The other two had to jump off, so we are up.
Thanks again, everybody. Stay tuned, and I hope we are, I guess, 2 days away from the beginning of fall, and although these temperatures the last couple of days are not traditional fall temperatures, as we see from the horrible flooding taking place in Puerto Rico. And I just was on the line, Senator Kaine and I, again yesterday with the FEMA administrator on trying to say, well, we want to make sure we help our friends in Puerto Rico. We still have got communities in Buchanan County that are still suffering from a major rainstorm they had back a month and a half ago, and we're strongly in support of the governor's request for FEMA assistance. It is one of the things, my frustration level with the formula that I think unfairly disadvantages rural communities, oftentimes rural communities that may have lower property values, so they never hit the aggregate number that you need to qualify for individual FEMA aid. I'm working on legislation, and I know I've talked to Congressman Griffith and Senator Kaine about this, to say we need to change this formula. America's a very generous country, and we want to help all folks in need. But right now, our existing system, I think, is terribly unfair to small rural communities on getting the aid that they need in their moments of tragedy as well. And more to say on that in the days and weeks to come. So thanks, everybody. Be safe.